Our speaker today, Dr. Virgil Storr, is a senior research fellow and director of graduate student programs at the Mercatus Center, George Mason University. He's also a research professor of economics in the Department of Economics at George Mason and the Don C. Lavoie Research Fellow in the F.A. Hayek program in philosophy, politics, and economics at George Mason. His doctorate in economics is from George Mason, and he completed his undergraduate work at Beloit College. He was born and grew up in the Bahamas, and prior to joining George Mason, he was the chief information officer for TSD Communications, communication strategy firm. He has published 3 books and numerous journal articles, and I can identify, I think, a number of influences on his work. His work has been influenced by what could be called the Austrian approach to economics, which features the role of entrepreneurship and individual agency. And I think we'll be hearing something about entrepreneurship today. But his work also reflects a keen interest in economic sociology. And the title for his 3 books, I think, will give some sense of this mix of interests. His first book is entitled Enterprising Slaves and Master Pirates, Understanding Economic Life in the Bahamas. In this book, he distinguishes 2 types of entrepreneurs in Bahamian economic life. The first one is the enterprising slave, who fosters an ethic of hard work, creativity, and productivity. And this is contrasted with the second type, what he calls the master pirate, who obtains success through cunning and deception. His second co-edited book, about which I think you'll speak more today, is titled The Political Economy of Hurricane Katrina, and his third book forthcoming is called Understanding the Culture of Markets. There's another influence on his work that I think worthy of note, and that is that Dr. Storr and his colleagues at George Mason are distinctive for being one segment of the economics profession that recognized the importance of the work of political scientist Elinor Ostrom before, in 2009, she became the first and so far the only woman to be awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics. The Nobel Prize Committee, in awarding this prize to her, described her contribution as challenging the conventional wisdom by demonstrating how local property can be successfully managed by the local commons without any regulation by central authorities or privatization. So this concept of the local commons, which I think we'll hear something about, is that voluntary arrangements between individual citizens can provide for community services in the absence of government provision. Recently, in my own case, the neighbor in back of our house and I agree that we were perfectly okay with not replacing the rail fence that deer traffic between our yards had knocked down. So this was a case of a local commons agreeing on community inaction. But another set of our neighbors agreed to share the cost of removing a tree that was going to fall from one of their yards onto that of the other. And so this was a local commons agreeing on community action. So Elinor Ostrom's insight is that such local voluntary arrangements have been much more pervasive in economic life in developing countries of the world than has often been recognized. And as I understand it, one of the aims of the research group to which Dr. Storr belongs is to extend this insight into many further settings. So today he will be telling us about work that has examined these processes in the Gulf of Mexico communities in the aftermath of the devastation of Hurricane Katrina. So I'm pleased to turn proceedings over to Dr. Storr.
Thank you, David, and thanks everybody for coming out this afternoon. So as a part of the Mercatus Center's at George Mason University's Gulf Coast Recovery Project, I spent the last 7 years working with my colleague, Professor Peter J. Becky, and my frequent co-author, Emily Chamley-Wright, trying to understand why and how communities recover from disasters like hurricanes or tornadoes, fires, floods. We spent several hundred hours interviewing disaster victims, mostly in the post-Katrina region, and found some answers, only a subset of which I'm going to talk about today. Today I'm going to talk about how entrepreneurs of all sorts, commercial entrepreneurs, but also political and social entrepreneurs, help communities recover from disaster. I'll give you my starting point. Disaster recovery, recovering from something like a Katrina, a massive storm like that, is a massive collective action problem. The cost of rebuilding are extremely high. Rebuilding a home that's been completely destroyed by a disaster like this takes money, takes time, There's a psychic toll of picking through the damage and destroyed keepsakes, and also the opportunity cost of rebuilding a home here as opposed to starting over elsewhere. But while the costs are high, and even extremely high, the benefits of rebuilding are necessarily uncertain and depend in large part on what will this community look like after the recovery period is up. What business opportunities will exist? Will I be able to get the job that I used to have prior to the disaster, after we recover from the disaster? If I own the business, will my clients or my customers come back? Will the same people be there to frequent my store? Similarly, what public services would be available after the recovery period is up? Will the school in my neighborhood be as good as the school was prior to the disaster? Additionally, will disrupted social networks be restored? Will my church come back? Will my pastor return to this neighborhood? Will the church be rebuilt? Will the congregants return? Will the social clubs that I belong to, will they come back? Will they be as they were before the storm? Will my neighbors, in fact, come back to the neighborhood after this big devastation? And so the benefits, to the extent that they depend on these questions, depend on answers to these questions, are uncertain. The worse the disaster, not only the worse, the higher the cost of rebuilding, but the more uncertain the benefits. It's more difficult to predict what life will be like in 5 years, 10 years, and what have you. And so in this kind of context, the rational move for any individual, in fact, the rational move for every individual, is to wait and see. It's being a first mover. The risk associated with being a first mover in this kind of context is being the first one to return to your community after this kind of thing, where the costs of rebuilding are extremely high and the benefits of rebuilding are very uncertain, could be prohibitive. And so how do communities overcome this situation where, given these high costs of rebuilding, given the uncertain benefits of rebuilding, how do communities in fact recover? And the solution to this problem, the solution to this massive collective action problem, is, I want to argue, in part the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur of all sorts is the hero of my story today. Now, in fact, I'll confess up front that I'm a big fan of the entrepreneur, even in normal times. I think of them as heroes, in fact, in normal times, right? They risk their livelihoods, neglect their families, work ridiculous hours to give us the things that we want, the goods that we want. The social and political entrepreneurs work to give us the societies and the policies that we want. Just think of Steve Jobs, right? That after all his efforts to give me the iPad that I'm embarrassingly addicted to, and the iPhone that I can't go anywhere without, in the months before his death, dying of cancer, he's working to give me the iPad 3, a new technology, right? So think of Martin Luther King, again, a political entrepreneur in the way I'm thinking about it. His willingness to risk his life to work for civil rights. And so in normal times, entrepreneurs bring about technological transformation, social transformation, political transformation. And after the disaster, and this is what I'm going to focus on today, entrepreneurs help to solve the collective action problem. I want to talk today about the whys of it, why they do it, and how they do it. Before I get into the body of my talk, let me give you a roadmap of where I want to go today. Spent a little bit of time at the beginning talking about the political economy of disasters and post-disaster recovery. Why an economist? I'm an economist by training, as Dr. Mitch said. Why an economist would be interested in this kind of question. What questions someone interested in the political economy of disasters and post-disaster recovery would want to answer. What's the puzzle to be solved? And then I want to give you a quick report card on how New Orleans in particular is the case I'm going to focus in on today, how New Orleans is doing in the aftermath of Katrina, some 7 years on. I'm going to highlight some of the specific challenges related to Katrina, a hurricane on August 29, 2005, flooding levels that in some areas was as much as 12 feet, that lasted for weeks in some areas before the floodwaters receded. in a city that's 49% below sea level, a disaster that gets described as the largest natural disaster in the history of the US. It's not exactly true, but it certainly is the costliest disaster in US history. And then I'm gonna spend some time talking about the whys. People would return and try to rebuild after something like that, and the hows. I'm gonna talk about the role of commercial entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship and political entrepreneurship. And if I have some time at the end, I'm gonna share with you some thoughts on post-disaster public policy. So a project to understand the political economy of post-disaster recovery begins in part with this observation by John Stuart Mill. In the Principles of Political Economy, he wrote, "The perpetual consumption and reproduction of capital," he could have said by entrepreneurs there, I think, "affords the explanation of what has so often excited wonder. The great rapidity with which countries recover from a state of devastation, the disappearance in a short time of all traces of the mischiefs done by earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, and the ravages of war. An enemy lays waste to a country by fire and sword, and destroys or carries away nearly all of the movable wealth existing in it. All the inhabitants are ruined, and yet in a few years after, everything is much as it was before." To get at what Mill's view of disaster and disaster recovery is, you can think of, say, a software development firm where you take all the employees out of the building where the firm is housed, and you put them in the parking lot and you destroy the building, right? And that once the building is rebuilt, Mill's prediction is that the firm operates as it was before. It's as successful as it was before. It has the same capacities that it does before. The effects, the evidence that the building had once been destroyed is evaporated because the firm is functioning as it was before. So this is what he thinks is going on post-disaster, and we set out to see if and how that would occur after Katrina. There are reasons to believe that it might occur, or that it would occur, right? Think of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and the subsequent fires. $400 million in 1906 dollars, $10 billion in damage in today's dollars, 3,000 deaths, 300,000 of the 400,000 residents there at the time left homeless, and 10 years later, by 1915, fully recovered. And so we wondered if this would be the case after Katrina. So let me tell you a little bit about Katrina and then give you a report card of post-Katrina recovery, and then spend some time talking about the whys and hows. Hurricane Katrina, again, significant disaster in the U.S. history, about 1,500 casualties in the greater New Orleans region. In fact, that number, the most recent number is 1,824 deaths related to Katrina. Over $100 billion in property damage as a result. Over 55% of the homes in Orleans Parish, the borders of Orleans Parish and New Orleans are the same borders, had major to severe damage. Major damage is damage above $15,000 worth of damage to severe damage, or completely destroyed. Hundreds of thousands left homeless, tens of thousands of businesses affected, hundreds of thousands of job losses. Now, of course, this is small relative to, say, the Haitian earthquake in 2010, right, where there were 215,000 dead and over 1 million left homeless. But as you can see by the pictures that I'm going to show you, the damage to New Orleans was significant. Again, extreme flooding, just to remind you of what the scenes on TV were like at the time. The massive failures of the official system of disaster rescue and relief, right? You have there the Superdome and the Convention Center. Homes destroyed or significantly damaged. Again, at the start of 2006, a few months after Katrina, as residents were let back in to perhaps begin rebuilding their lives, this was the typical scene. And this. And this. And so not surprisingly, post-Katrina recovery has been slow and is still incomplete. Prior to Katrina, there were 200,000 active households in Orleans Parish. Now, what do I mean by an active household? By active household, I just mean that there's someone living on the property and they're receiving mail. And so it's in many ways, it overestimates the recovery. It's an optimistic view of the recovery. Just before, in the August before Katrina hit, there were 200,000 active households in Orleans Parish. A year after Katrina, there was just over 102,000 active households. 2 years after Katrina, in September 2007, there was just under 140,000 active households. In 2010, 5 years after Katrina, there was just under 160,000 active households. That number is about 81% now, 7 years later. And so the recovery's been slow and it's still incomplete. If by recovery we mean as Mill predicted, all the evidence that there was in fact a disaster has been wiped away. The recovery has also been uneven. That even in the months following Katrina, it was common to talk about it as the checkerboard city, right? Some communities within a few years of Katrina were at pre-Katrina levels. In fact, some had greater than pre-Katrina levels as people moved from devastated neighborhoods into ones that weren't as devastated. And some communities, even today, are still hovering around 60% recovered, right? If you drive through some of these neighborhoods, in fact, you see raised buildings where neighborhoods used to exist. And so the central question that we asked in our research, and that we've been trying to get at, was why did people return? And how did people overcome the collective action problem that is post-disaster recovery? Again, remember, the cost of returning and rebuilding are extremely high, but the benefits of returning and rebuilding are very uncertain. And so how is it that people overcame this challenge? Our approach was to take an interview-based qualitative methods. We interviewed 300 people in the affected area. Depending on how you define the affected area, that number grows to about 350 people that we interviewed. In each of these interviewed, we asked them about their communities prior to Katrina. We asked them about their Katrina experiences, had them sort of talk through some harrowing tales of what people went through in the face of Katrina. And then we talked to them, importantly, and this is what I'm going to talk about here, what challenges they faced when they were deciding whether or not to come back, and how, in fact, they overcame those challenges. And we talked to 103 people in New Orleans evacuees still living in Houston 3 years after the storm, because we wanted to get a sense of what it was that was standing in the way of their coming back. And we got, when asking those questions, we got a series of answers, only some of which I'm going to talk about today. Again, I should say we talked to over 450 people. That one of the things that as a social scientist you learn in that kind of context is there's no one post-disaster, post-Katrina recovery story. In fact, there are probably 450 at least in the people that we talked to. But there's some common themes and commonalities that I want to focus on today. In terms of the why, I want to focus on sense of place, the stressing over and over again of the uniqueness of New Orleans that came out in the research. And in the how, I want to talk today about the role of entrepreneurship of all forms. Again and again, our subjects stressed when asked why they returned to New Orleans. They stressed the uniqueness of New Orleans. Paul, who's a resident of the Vietnamese American community in New Orleans East that I'm going to talk about, whose community I'm going to talk a lot more about later, says very clearly your identity, your community, your culture, your life, your heritage can all be had here in this place. I think that's what it was we're fighting for, you know, underneath it all. And Tran, also from that community. We came back because we're all Vietnamese. This place is like our second homeland. So we have to come back to rebuild this place. So while it was common for the people we talked to stress the uniqueness of New Orleans, the characteristics that they pointed out were extremely different, right? That when Paul and Tran are talking, that they're talking about their specific neighborhood, New Orleans East, where they built an exclusive New Orleans-specific ethnic, religious, language community, right? Where the church, the local Catholic Church held Vietnamese language masses, where they had meeting spaces for members of the Vietnamese community and for both non-religious and religious groups, where they had social spaces where members of that congregation got together and met, where they had weekend markets that sold Vietnamese produce and Vietnamese arts and crafts, and it became very clear in the time after Katrina that it was very difficult to recreate this community elsewhere, and it was in many ways essential that, especially for the older members of the community, that they do so. For instance, many of the older members of this community, in fact, didn't speak English, and so when they were living in say, a Houston or an Atlanta with family members in a community that didn't have this Vietnamese language flavor, they would describe feeling handicapped, right? That in New Orleans, in the Vietnamese American community that they were able to create, they could be fully productive members of their community. That they had Vietnamese doctors at the ready, they had Vietnamese lawyers, they had Vietnamese accountants. In Houston, that wasn't there. They had to be dependent on others. And so for members of this community, there was simply no place like New Orleans. But again, this wasn't just the Vietnamese Americans in New Orleans that said this thing. Again and again, in every community that we went into, there was the stressing of the uniqueness of New Orleans and it being the place that they had to return to. That Ed Williams from the Lower Ninth Ward, which is one of the poor neighborhoods in New Orleans, a neighborhood that had the social ills that you would expect in poor neighborhoods, said, no, that ain't never crossed my mind not to come back. This is my home. Why would I leave? This is my home. And similarly, Ronald Jones. There's no place like New Orleans. I've been to all kinds of parts of the world. It's just different. The food, the history, the culture, the architecture, the music. There's no place like New Orleans. And we have the best politicians money can buy. We elect politicians that couldn't get elected as a dog catcher in other states. There's just something about New Orleans. And Robert Jackson, also from the Ninth Ward community. New Orleans is a city that is unlike any place I've ever been. Everything about it is unique. And Martin Davis, the flavor of New Orleans is unlike any other. And I've been to a lot of cities. I've lived in a lot of cities in my lifetime. And everywhere from the East Coast to the West Coast, and there's nothing like New Orleans. I could show quote after quote that captures that. That has that same flavor, that has that same, that almost everybody we talk to, when asked why they came back, would express something along these lines. Now, of course, everyone can say something like that about their community, right? In sort of the immortal words of Dorothy, there's no place like home. But, and so I live in Manassas now, and so certainly there's no place like a Manassas either, right, in many ways. But that people from this neighborhood that's been so disparaged from the outside world, that is in fact one of the poor neighborhoods in New Orleans, that has the social ills that you associate with poor neighbors, the crime, the poor schools, et cetera, that even people there are willing to articulate this, they're willing to say there's no place like New Orleans, when in many of these situations they had the opportunity to rebuild a life in a Houston, to rebuild a life in Atlanta, to move along, that they were willing to articulate this is the reason for their return is quite significant. In fact, 84% of the people that we talked to when they talked about either why they returned or why, when we talked to the people in New Orleans, why they hoped to return. It was the uniqueness of New Orleans that they highlighted. And so sense of place, this uniqueness of New Orleans, there's no place like New Orleans, explains the why. But what explains the how? Because again, even if you want to come back, you still have this challenge, right? You still have really high cost and really uncertain benefits that everyone is facing. And for everyone, again, being a first mover, being the first one to come back, being amongst the first few to come back, could be extremely risky. You could come back and the rest of your community not come back. And you're left with moving into a neighborhood that's not the neighborhood that you'd hoped, not the home neighborhood that you expected. And so the how, again, the heroes of this story are the entrepreneurs, the commercial, social, and political entrepreneurs. And so let me take them each in turn and talk about what each of these groups of entrepreneurs did. After Katrina, commercial entrepreneurs signaled that particular communities were recovering. Again, there was a lot of uncertainty after a disaster, and the commercial entrepreneurs cut through that noise, cut through that uncertainty. And of course, which was not surprising, provided key materials and services to facilitate rebuilding, including the rebuilding of social spaces, places that people spent time together, hung out, associated. So let me tell you about Casey Kasem. Casey is the owner of Discount Zone in the 9th Ward. It's a gas station, but it also has a laundromat. It also has a little food convenience store. It also has a little cafe that serves hot dishes. Again, he's in the 9th Ward, so that community that I talked about. Casey and the entrepreneurs that I'll talk about here, when I say they're the hero of this story, they're the hero in terms of helping these communities recover, but many of them are actually heroes in their own right. And so Casey actually saved lives in the aftermath of Katrina, right? That he waited out the storm in his store, in the second story, which also has apartments on the second floor. He waited out the storm in the second floor apartment. And he invited a couple of his employees that lived in less secure places to actually wait out the storm with him in his newer, more secure structure in the second floor. And he had the idea, because he thought, and there'd been some talk that there might be some flooding. They didn't expect the level of flooding, but he knew there might be some flooding, that he had the idea of getting his boat and actually tying it to the building. And so as the storm approaches, the Katrina comes and passes, the levees breach, the floodwaters rush in, he has a boat tied to the building. That once the flooding is there, he starts to hear screams from his neighbors who were trapped on the top of buildings. And so in floodwaters that are, again, potentially dangerous, he's on top of a gas station, so there's oil and there's all this stuff that's floating around, so he's actually risking his life to go out. He goes out and starts rescuing people and bringing them back to his second floor perch above his convenience store and gas station. And then he takes them to the bridge to where they were being evacuated by police officers. And so he's a genuine hero in his own right, sort of having risked his life to actually save people in the wake of Katrina. But he also, in opening up his store, which was one of the first gas stations to open up in all of New Orleans and one of the first convenience stores to open up in that community post-Katrina, played an important role in 9th Ward recovery. He was an early sign that the 9th Ward would in fact recover, right? It was a sign of a return to normalcy. That the fact that his store was open, that you could go there and get gas and go there and buy basic food stuff, and also go there and interact with the members in your from your neighborhood was an important signal that things were going back to normal. And so one of the first things that commercial entrepreneurs do is that they signal this return to normalcy. They signal that by opening up their store, by their efforts, signal that the community is going to come back. And they also, which would be expected of a store, right, they provided key materials. And I'm going to talk here about the managers of some of the large department stores like Walmart, who played a key role. And so after Katrina, particularly in the immediate aftermath of Katrina, store managers, in fact, provided free merchandise, including prescription drugs for members of their community. And so it's not something you would expect from Walmart, but a Canada, Louisiana employee, for instance, used a forklift. Power was out, used a forklift to knock open the warehouse door to get water for a local retirement home, and just gave it away to the local retirement home. In Maria, Louisiana, employees allowed the local police officers to use their store as a headquarters and a sleeping place, as many of them had lost their lives. In Waveland, Mississippi, again, we covered our project, looked at the whole Gulf Coast. An assistant manager, Jessica Lewis, who couldn't get her supervisors to get permission or what have you, decided to run a bulldozer through her store, collect up basic that weren't water damage, and then she piled them in the parking lot. This is in the day after Katrina hit. Piles them in the parking lot and just gave them away to residents. She also broke into the store's pharmacy to get critical supplies of local drugs, the drugs that she took to the local hospital. And so, you know, contrast this kind of enterprise with sort of the scenes that I showed you from the city-run evacuation centers or what have you, where there were people waiting for water for days, or what have you. Stores like Walmart also ship, 2,500 truckloads of merchandise into the affected area within days of the storm, and all but 15 of Walmart's 126 stores in the entire Gulf Coast region were open within days of the storm. So again, providing necessary materials for people to rebuild. If you're going to rebuild, you're going to need the war things in order to rebuild. And so that's what sort of the role of commercial entrepreneurs. And I start there just because I don't want that to be forgotten, because I do think that they played an important role. But what I'm spending a little bit more time actually talking about the role of social and political entrepreneurs and what they did after Katrina. And that they, after Katrina, social and political entrepreneurs, reduced the uncertainty around returning and rebuilding, serving as first movers and coordinating return in many instances, collecting information on evacuees and their intentions and sharing them with other members of the community. Social and political entrepreneurs also organized and engaged in outreach and activism and advocacy on behalf of their communities, keeping their members of the community informed of about political developments, lobbying representatives and other government officials for resources. Some communities in the in the months following Katrina were not going to be permitted to return based on the plans that were taking shape at the time. And so these social and political entrepreneurs lobbied on behalf of their communities just to even get the right to have their communities return and rebuild. They helped cut through the bureaucratic red tape that emerged after stuff like this, helping members of their community fill out insurance claims and forms for the road home program that was going to provide assistance to people who had suffered damage in the wake of Katrina. And social and political entrepreneurs directly assisted in the rebuilding effort, providing essential services, gutting and actually gutting houses and rebuilding houses, or providing sheetrock or the kinds of materials that we needed, or the kinds of services that were essential in the days after, days and months and years after Katrina. And so let me tell you about Father Vienne and the leadership of the Mary Queen of Vietnam Church and what they did to reduce uncertainty around return. Father Vienne, in many respects, acted as a focal point around which community members in his neighborhood could coordinate. So a little bit about the community that Father Vienne played such an important role in helping to rebuild. So at the top far right corner is East New Orleans, and in that community, a smaller subset of that community is what I'm calling the Mary Queen of Vietnam community, which is a Vietnamese American neighborhood with the Mary Queen of Vietnam Church at the center. Within about a mile radius of the church, 95% of its congregation, of its 5,000, the church's 5,000 congregants live, and those congregants are all Vietnamese American. This community has its roots in North Vietnam. That everyone in this community can trace their lineage to three villages in North Vietnam that happened to be Roman Catholic, and when Vietnam was petitioned in 1954, they were, with the aid of the Roman Catholic Church, were evacuated to the south, the southern part of Vietnam. And then when Saigon fell in 1975, they were, again with the aid of the Catholic Church, relocated to this community in New Orleans. It is I should say, a middle-income community. Its average income median income in that neighborhood is about what median income is in all of New Orleans. It was also one of the hardest hit communities following Katrina. It had at least 5 feet worth of flood water everywhere, with flood depths as much as 12 feet in some neighborhoods. In fact, the Urban Land Institute, which was the consultant to the Bring New Orleans Back commission, which was set to plan what the new New Orleans would look like after Katrina, had said that there would have to be significant study before even allowing this community to be built. But by April of 2006, 1,200 of the 4,000 members 4,000 people who lived in this neighborhood had returned, and by the summer of 2007, within 2 years of Katrina hitting, 90% of the population had returned. That this recovery rate is remarkable when compared to other neighborhoods. At the same time, 2 years after Katrina, in Lakeview, the richest, one of the richest neighborhoods in New Orleans at the time, only 10% of their residents had recovered. And they had not had the same level of damage as this New Orleans East community. And this quick recovery rate, this 90%, is surprising because the consensus, at least in the early writings after Katrina, was that the communities that would come back the fastest would be the richest communities and would be the ones that were the most politically connected. But again, like I said, this community was a middle-income community. It wasn't one of the richest communities at all. In fact, it had outpaced many of the richer communities in terms of recovery. In fact, outpaced significantly some of the richest communities. And it wasn't politically connected at all. In fact, it was very insular. It wasn't until after Katrina hit that it saw, as a community, members saw a need to be politically active. Prior to that, it was a very insular community. And yet, 90% within 2 years of Katrina had returned. And so how did they do it? A lot of the credit, when you talk to the members of that community, go to Father Bien and the Mary Queen of Vietnam leadership. I should say, as I said with Casey, that many of these entrepreneurs that I'm describing as heroes because of what they did to promote recovery after Katrina hit were, in fact, also heroes in a legitimate sense. That Father Bien, with some of the older members of his community, decided to wait out the storm in the church hall. The storm passes with not much harm, in fact, to this neighborhood. And so people in the morning after, immediately following Katrina's passing, decide to go home. Within minutes of them deciding to go home, the floodwaters start coming in. And so Father Bien the scene flashes to Father Bien on a boat, actually going to the homes of the people who had left the church prematurely to save their lives. And so again, a hero in his own right. But what I want to talk about is what he did to bring about the speedy recovery of his community. And the first thing he did was he prioritized rebuilding the church. And so what he did was he rebuilt the very core of this exclusive New Orleans-specific ethnic, religious, language community that I had talked about earlier. That he decided to rebuild the church and use it as a staging area for recovery. That within days of Katrina, after his people had been evacuated to other places in Louisiana and Texas and Georgia and Arkansas, he and his fellow pastors start visiting these evacuation sites. And as they're visiting these sites, they're playing an interesting game. I'll describe it as a game. Every time they go to a site, they say two things. I just visited the site over here, and all of them said that they were coming back to New Orleans, right? And then they'd go, not having said that, then they'd go to the next site and say, oh, I just visited that site in Atlanta. They all say that they're coming back to New Orleans. And so immediately he's focusing the members of that community on return. That the agenda is to return, and that everybody was going to return. And because of the faith that they had in him and his leadership of the church, they knew if he said that everybody else was returning, that everybody else would return. So he ended up being this focal point around return. The other thing he did was that he began holding services as soon as he possibly could. And so within 6 weeks of the storm, the church is open, he's holding Mass in the church hall. That first Mass in 6 weeks after attracts 300 people. The one that he holds the week after attracts 800. At the third one that he holds after Katrina, that's 8 weeks after, just 8 weeks after the storm had passed, at a time when much of New Orleans is a ghost town, he invites the local bishop, who had been a former pastor of the church, and they get 2,000 people to show up to this. And again, all the time, he's taking pictures of the people who are showing up to the Mass, he's circulating it to other people, letting them know that this community was a vibrant community that was going to return. And so as perhaps members in other communities are struggling to answer these questions about what will my community be like after the storm, will my neighbors come back, will my clients or customers come back, will I be able to get that old job, that Father Vienne, through his efforts, are convincing people that in fact the community is going to look very much after Katrina as it looked before Katrina. And so he's doing a good job to cut through that noise that exists in a post-disaster environment. That he's also using the fact that this community was coming back, and using the fact that he was confident this community come back, and was convincing people it was coming back, to shame public officials into turning on utilities and to provide other services, right? That the position of the utilities and the local government was that it didn't make sense to provide public services to communities that were ghost towns. Well, of course, if you don't provide public services, then the community will remain a ghost town. And so he was able to, with these pictures of 2,000, a church that's almost as full as it was before the disaster, convince the public officials that they ought to start collecting garbage, they ought to start providing police services, that they ought to turn on the lights. And he also, because remember, many members in this community didn't speak English and what have you, he worked it so that much of the aid to that community was flowing through the church. And so he was confident that it was ethnically appropriate, that he was doing the translations, that he was making sure that they understood what they had access to. And so one of the important roles that social and political entrepreneurs play after disaster that helps to explain the how of recovery is in reducing this uncertainty, is in cutting down this noise. Another important role they play is in organization and activism. Let me tell you about LaToya Cantrell and the Broadmoor Improvement Association. Broadmoor is right above Uptown on the map there, is a middle-class, extremely diverse community near Central City in the heart of New Orleans. that it, again, like New Orleans East community, suffered extreme devastation in the wake of as a result of Katrina and the flooding that followed. That within 2 years of Katrina, though, 66%, so not the 90% New Orleans East, but 66% of that community, 66% of the houses in that community were livable or under repair. And so let me tell you about the organization and activism that LaToya Cantrell and the Broadmoor Improvement Association engaged in. Right? One of the first things they did was they ensured that members were kept abreast of the political developments. Right? That it had been a robust neighborhood association prior to Katrina, and so it had fairly good lists of people who lived in that community. It also, used some of the members of the board were connected, so they were able to, in some instances, use government records to figure out who lived in the community. And what they did were, one of the important things that they did was ensure that members of the community were kept abreast of the developments that were happening after Katrina. Perhaps the most significant thing they did, though, the BIA did, and under LaToya's leadership, was they lobbied to resist what's called the Green Dot. And so let me tell you a little bit about what the local New Orleans government did sort of in the months following Katrina. They set up what the Bring New Orleans Back Commission, which was a commission of mostly developers, some political appointments, that were going to figure out what the new New Orleans was going to look like, right? And so their mission was to plan, to engage essentially in comprehensive planning for what a new New Orleans would look like. They did two things as a part of this plan. First thing they did was that they declared a moratorium on issuing building permits, and so you couldn't build until, in fact, they figured out whether or not your community was going to be allowed to recover. The second thing they did was decide that this was an opportunity to, quote unquote, reduce the footprint in New Orleans. And so they designated actual parts of New Orleans as potential green space. That people would get, in fact, the initial report, and where their homes were would be a green dot that signaled that you're not going to be allowed to rebuild here. This is going to, where your house is now is going to be green space. And so through their mobilization effort, through a series of sort of emails and a marketing campaign and bringing people back for a series of meetings, they were able to effectively lobby against this green dot. But they took it one step further. In fact, they decided that since New Orleans was going to be engaged in this community level planning, that they ought to as well, because they couldn't count on, remember, that community was going to be green space, they couldn't count on New Orleans officials looking out for their interests, and so they developed, in fact, their own revitalization plan. That she tapped members of the board who had connections with urban planners and with architects and with school board administrators and what have you, and other officials to figure out what the new Broadmoor would look like. But it was a new Broadmoor where the input into that process was from the people who actually once resided in Broadmoor. And so in addition to cutting through the noise and reducing uncertainty, social and political entrepreneurs played a key role in organization and activism post-Katrina. Again, another important thing that social and political entrepreneurs did post-Katrina was cut through bureaucratic red tape. You wouldn't imagine the level of sort of red tape that exists that in fact stands in the way of people just trying to rebuild from something like a disaster. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Doris Foytier, who's the superintendent of the St. Bernard Parish Unified School District. St. Bernard's actually not on the map, but it's just to the right of the map. It's right next to right across the bridge from the Lower Ninth Ward. It is a blue-collar community. It suffered Again, 8 to 10 feet worth of flooding, 8 to 10 feet flood depths. That it also, though, like Broadmoor, like New Orleans East, was quick to recover after Katrina. So let me tell you about what Doris Fortier did. That she, again, I keep talking about these entrepreneurs, here, political entrepreneur, being heroes in their own right. So let me tell you about Doris's disaster story. That she, in St. Bernard Parish, the 2 schools are set to be evacuation sites of last resort for people who can't escape the city or whatever. She's manning one of them. They expect, as in, you know, when there are things like hurricanes and they do get these warnings, that they'll get, you know, some of the poor, more disadvantaged members of the community will actually show up at the evacuation site, and they're thinking maybe 200, 250 people would show up at the evacuation site, at the school where she's housed. She's manning the school with a few of her administrators and some local firefighters. Instead of the 250, they end up with close to 1,500 people show up once the floodwaters roll in. And so she is she is assisting people who can't get up to the second story, up to the second story. She is, in fact, taking charge of the situation and making sure that people don't panic. She's got a lot of cachet because she taught in the school system for over 30 years, and so she practically taught all of the people that in fact had evacuated to the site, and so she has enormous authority, and they're listening to her. And for 4 days, for 4 days, so until Thursday, when they're able to leave that site, that she's running and managing this evacuation site with 0 resources. And so Doris Fortier had become the superintendent of the St. Bernard Parish Unified School District a year before Katrina. She'd been an associate superintendent. She'd been a teacher in the schools before that. When Katrina comes, the result is that all 20 of the school buildings under her control are significantly damaged. And most, if not all, are not usable. But she sees that she realizes that if the police officers and the firefighters and the local government officials are to stay, if they're not going to evacuate like their families had before, which she realized was critical for those communities recovering, that she had to find a place for their children, that they wouldn't return, they would have to leave, and they wouldn't be able to bring back their families if there weren't schools. And so she promises in mid-October that every student who signed up for classes at the November 1st registration would have a spot. And she expected maybe 50, right? Because she's thinking, again, it's going to be the children of the firefighters and the policemen and the government officials or whatever. She's expecting 50. In fact, she ends up with 703 students sign up for schools. This is at a time when she doesn't know where she's going to put them. She doesn't have classes. She doesn't have rooms, and what have you. And so 703 students. That by January, she's got 1,500 students that are talking about coming back. By April of the next year, she's got 2,000 students. This is 1/4 of the school population in St. Bernard Parish that are coming back. All the time, she's trying to rebuild the school system for the people of St. Bernard Parish. She's running into roadblocks, left, right, and center, right? That she initially got a pledge from the Army Corps of Engineers that they would, in fact, provide the modular school buildings, and so she thought that was taken care of. It turns out that their initial pledge of we'll have them to you in 90 days turns out to be we'll have them to you in 6 months, turns out to be maybe by October of the beginning of the next school year. And so rather than engaging in that at all, she decides that she's just gonna get a local contractor. She's like, I'm gonna find my own school buildings and I'm gonna send you the bill, right? And so that's the sort of first thing she does. The FEMA, she secures from FEMA, again, her teachers don't have places to live. She secures from FEMA trailers to in fact potentially host classes and also to living spaces. They tell her that, well, these particular trailers are not zoned for, don't meet the standards necessary for a classroom because they don't have double doors and what have you, and so they can't be used for that. So she's like, so she has the trailers, she can't use them. She's like, well, maybe can I at least use them to hook up clothing washer and dryers, because at least that'll be a use. I have teachers, again, living in cars or living in trailers or whatever. They need some place to wash their clothes. They say, okay. The FEMA supervisor for a project rotates out, a new one comes in. She ends up under investigation for breaking FEMA rules for misappropriating government property. But again, she's facing all these kinds of challenges throughout, and she is at every stage working to cut through these barriers that are thrown up before. That this role, again, I can't help but reiterate, of opening up the schools and providing a place for the children in that community is an essential aspect to that community recovery. Absent the schools, parents can't move back. They can't start rebuilding their homes. They can't start, they have to stay in the Houstons or the Atlantas that they've been evacuated to. Because she, again, without waiting on permission, goes and opens up the school system and then finds a way, in spite of like obstacles, to in fact provide classrooms for those students, ends up being extremely critical. And so the final thing that I want to talk about that social and political entrepreneurs do, in addition to, again, reducing the uncertainty that exists and that characterizes the post-disaster environment, in addition to organization and activism that proves extremely important when your neighborhood, in fact, is zoned to not recover and to not be allowed to recover. In addition to cutting through the bureaucratic red tape that often existed, that often stood in the way of communities getting back, they provided critical services in the days and weeks and months and now years following Katrina. I'm going to just give you a couple of examples. I could, again, slides after slides after slides of examples of what they did, but one of particular note is the Katrina crew, which organized volunteers both from New Orleans but from around the country to help clean up in the wake of Katrina. They, mobilizing 10,000 volunteers over the first year after Katrina, ended up moving 250,000 tons of debris out of people's homes. That Habitat for Humanity and other similar agencies that help actually built houses for people to return to. Project KID, in the same way that Doris Foytier's work with the school system was essential, realized that this need that if you're going to have people here that have children that are going to try to rebuild their homes, the only way that's going to be possible is if they have childcare. You can't, some of their homes at the time were, again, you've got mold on the walls, they're having to gut their homes. You can't even hub the child in the house as you're doing these kinds of things. And so they decide that they're going to provide free childcare until Project KID. And then others provided, again, food and clothing and shelter and organized that from around the country. And so commercial entrepreneurs, after Katrina, are playing a critical role in providing the essential services and goods and services that people need in order to rebuild. They're playing an important role in signaling that communities are returning to normal. After Katrina, and disasters generally. Social and political entrepreneurs are playing a critical role in reducing uncertainty around cutting through this noise that exists in the post-disaster environment, in organizing and engaging in activism, in cutting through the red tape and providing these critical services. And so, in closing, I want to just give sort of some thoughts on post-disaster public policy. I'm not going to go through them all, but they sum up to basically two, right? That one is if entrepreneurs are in fact able to play this kind of role that I'm talking about, and that we sort of show in our research around Katrina, then public policy needs to work to create an environment where these entrepreneurs can actually succeed and thrive. And in fact, at the very least, public policy, government should get out of the way. It should not be inhibiting, should not be preventing, should not be throwing up roadblocks to these entrepreneurs that are trying to help these communities rebuild. Second, and the second thing that it sort of sums up to, is that government should deliver what they promise, right? So in the immediate aftermath of Katrina, and you may remember this, there are promises from, say, the President of the United States, who says, we will do what it takes to make sure that New Orleans is what it was before the storm, right? That's a very grand style promise. You have with the Bring New Orleans Back Commission, and in fact, the 5 comprehensive plans for post-Katrina New Orleans that existed in the 5 years following Katrina. Every year they had a new comprehensive plan for what New Orleans would look like, that envisioned complete top-down re-engineering of the whole city, some of which we're talking about light rail systems from the poorest communities to the city centers, of extremely grandiose plans. Instead of doing that kind of stuff, instead of promising the world that what the people in these communities needed was basic government services that existed prior to Katrina, right? Just the promise that the lights would be on, the water would be on, we would actually patrol these neighborhoods, we would collect the garbage, right? Those kinds of promises would have been much more useful to the members of those communities than the grandiose promises that we will do whatever it takes to make sure that this community is what it was prior to Katrina. Because it was the absence of those kinds of things, the fact that there wasn't a pledge that we would reopen the school on such and such a date in some neighborhoods, that stopped people from being able to come back and rebuild. There wasn't the pledge that if in fact you went and rebuilt your home in this neighborhood, that we would we actually patrol this neighborhood again, that we would actually collect garbage, that stopped people from in fact returning and rebuilding. And so the sort of second big sort of policy prescription that comes out of this is promise very basic things, but deliver what you promise. And so with that, I think I'll stop and take your questions, and thank everybody for listening.
I took an urban sustainability class last semester, and for my final project, I actually did a project on post-Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans. And so I know a lot about the Bring New Orleans Back mission, how that ended up being a huge fail, and it created this big mistrust in the government between citizens, or the people returning. I know part of the reason for that was just kind of the differences in, I guess, defining sustainability between the way the government kind of perceived it and the way that community members perceived it. The government kind of took more of your classic economic equity, environment approach, whereas sustainability to people returning was very much basic community needs, and long-term needs too, as well as future job opportunities, maybe better schools in the future. Do you think if had the city not tried to jump on this right away, and had kind of broken those bonds of trust in the beginning, that there's any way they could have potentially worked with these
So they got, so as I mentioned, they multiple comprehensive redevelopment plans in the years following Katrina, and with each effort, they learned from the mistakes of the previous efforts, and by the time that they got to the last set of redevelopment plans, they were much better than the first set of redevelopment plans. And so it's certainly possible to do better jobs than they did. The thing that comes out, though, are the interviews, is that the wrong time to re-engineer a city is, in fact, in the wake of a extreme disaster, right? If again, after a disaster, there's already a whole lot of noise. There's already a whole lot of uncertainty. There's already a lot of questions that people want answers to, that feel that they need answers to, that they might not get answers to. There's a lot of stepping out on faith that people have to do, in fact, if these communities are going to come back at all. At that time, so imagine what could be the worst possible thing to do at that time. One thing that might be really bad to do is to say, okay, I know you have this desire to maybe rebuild, but why don't you wait a few months while we figure out whether or not we'll let you, and we figure out what the rules under which you'll be allowed to rebuild will be. That may be, if you sort of were thinking about what can I do to get in the way of community redevelopment, that might be like the first thing that came to your mind. I won't, in fact, let people rebuild at all. I'll make them wait. I'll tell them that the rules may or may not change, and I'll let you know down the road, right? And so that's the sort of first thing that if you were trying to stop redevelopment, you might do. The second thing you might do is when you, in fact, issue your report, your first report, have green dots in front of people's homes that say you can, in fact, rebuild. Right, like that may be the second. Or we'll only allow you to rebuild if you prove sustainability. But if I know that the government is already targeted my neighborhood to not come back, why am I going to come back? And oh, by the way, you prove sustainability not by saying that you want to come back, you prove sustainability by, in fact, coming back. But why would I come? So if you sort of think about the two things that you might do in order to get in the way of redevelopment, that those might be the two things that you come up with, and those are, in fact, the two things that they did. That if you, so let's think back to some disasters where you did have recovery that was quite robust. I talked about I'll mention it here because I talked about the San Francisco earthquake or whatever. They pretended in the wake of the San Francisco earthquake to talk about changing the building codes and making them more robust and making them such that they won't recover. But in fact, those rules were honored when they breached in the observance. That they did, they pretended to have rules, but they never attempted to enforce them. And so the homes, people were able to rebuild their homes quite rapidly after that. I think that so that was a long answer to get to the shorter answer, which is that re-engineering a city from the top down in the moment of the disaster is probably a bad idea, even if you sort of, your intentions are good because you want to make sure that something like this doesn't happen again.
Right. Would it have been, do you think it could have potentially been a successful endeavor had they waited and had they included like these community leaders or just the community themselves in these plans instead of just creating these plans without any sort of like residential involvement?
Yeah, so I think that they subsequent plans did more of that, and to the extent that they did it, they were better. The danger with replanning a city after a disaster, though, I think is just a danger. That the act of planning itself, the level of uncertainty that gets created by just saying, hey, I'm gonna wait a minute, we're gonna figure out what this community is gonna look like in a few years, and don't do anything until we do it, is in itself a pretty dangerous thing. And so, yes, the plans would have been potentially better if they'd included more community input and what have you, but no, I'm not confident that planning at all was in fact, top-down planning of that sort at all was in fact the problem. Other questions?
I guess this is a rhetorical question.
So I'm off the hook for having to provide an answer. Okay.
I'm not even holding you to be an economist, but it's going to sound like it. As an economist,
Okay.
do you think that New Orleans should be rebuilt? If you were an insurance agency, would you carry on business in New Orleans?
So let me give a couple of reactions to that. It's my first answer to that is I don't know, right? Which is the safe punt to say, right? That I don't know. That it is true that the only reason that people were able to get insurance in New Orleans was because the neighborhoods that in fact ended up being the most flooded were designated as not being floodplains at all, and so they weren't required to have flood insurance for the places that in fact had the worst flooding. And so to the extent that a bank wouldn't lend you money to build a house or buy a house that was underinsured, the fact that you were able in fact to get insurance because we pretended like in fact flooding would never occur there suggests maybe that this isn't an optimal place to build a house or what have you. But that, and again, if, it's also not terribly surprising that, in a city that's 49% below sea level, that when there's a lot of rain, it fills up, right? That's actually not a surprising thing as well. So there are reasons why you might think that it's a bad idea to build there, right? That said, that that kind of decision, I think, is up to the. Let me add another reason why maybe it's a bad idea to rebuild there, though, before I sort of give the punt. That it's unclear if people would have lived there if they didn't have the expectation that if it was completely destroyed, that they wouldn't be fully bailed out. Right. So that's another sort of. And so there's a lot of the signals that people usually use when they decide where and how to own a home were distorted or dampened or in some cases amplified out of whack. And so there's reasons to believe that maybe you wouldn't have had the New Orleans that you had prior to Katrina, or in fact the New Orleans that's coming back post-Katrina, if it wasn't for some of these distorted signals. That said, people get to decide where and how they live. And so my point, and what sort of I think comes out of the when I talk about the post-disaster public policy stuff, is don't distort the signals. Right? People with the signals appropriate, right? That they're the actual risk of flooding is factored into their insurance premiums. If they have clear expectations about whether or not there would be full restitution in the wake of another disaster, these kinds of things. If those things weren't there, if those distortions that existed that sort of led to New Orleans being how it was weren't there, and people decided to build there, then I think it should be rebuilt. And so I don't know how that all shakes out at the end of the day, but did that get to your?
Well, that's one of the problems with the economic model is that there are certain assumptions that are made by economists that then get distorted, as you just said. And then I'm not an economist, you can probably tell. To my analysis, the economic model falls to pieces, and that it doesn't carry much weight when society purposely builds in distortions. And so I'm not quite sure what value the economic model has here, except that sometimes it tells us we should be doing this, but we've decided not to.
Yeah, but
I think in the case of New Orleans, if you look at the cost of rebuilding the probability, the rising probability of recurrence, particularly with rising sea level, increasing storm intensity and frequency, these kinds of things that are hazards that directly affect New Orleans, it probably economically it doesn't make any sense to rebuild there. But we decide for other reasons to do some cultural, that's where we've lived all of our lives, et cetera. How do you, that is a dialectic, how do you balance one against the other?
Well, I mean, happily, I'm not the one that's got to do the balancing, right? and so I personally don't, and we don't try to in our research. And in our research, we're completely silent on whether or not New Orleans should be rebuilt. What we are, what we're talking about, what I talked about today, in many ways assumes that New Orleans will be rebuilt. And so then the question is how, right? And that how is it that communities after something like this are gonna get back on their feet, return to what life was like prior to the storm, right? And that the how that we come up with in part is, well, these entrepreneurs do a really great job, and they do a really great job even when there's this noise, even when there's these distortions. They in fact do a good job of cutting through the distortions and drawing bright lines and becoming beacons in the face of those kinds of distortions. And so that's sort of where we try to keep our research, and we're agnostic, I guess, on whether or not if from a sort of central planner's view of the world with all the relevant costs and benefits, if you decide to let New Orleans come back or not, is a question that we remain silent on. Any other questions?
I've got a question further. And this is actually sort of from an economic model, more of a devil's advocate question. So on your second point there about not wanting to re-engineer right after a disaster, using a framework of Mansur Olson, who, as you know, taught down the road here for many years in College Park, his perspective could be that a disaster can be sort of a good thing in the sense that you sweep away the special interest groups. And so it can be beneficial. And I'm wondering if an application of that is actually what happened with the school system, because I read recently some very favorable reports of New Orleans improvements in education. People attribute this to charter schools coming in and boosting things. And there's this ongoing debate, tension between charter schools and the sort of regular public school system. But the framework using Mansur Olson would be that sort of sweeping away the interest groups there allowed the charter school system to come in and sort of work what charter schools can do. So I'm just wondering what your take would be on that kind of perspective.
Yeah, so I had one of our master's students, I was on a committee, actually wrote a thesis on the charter schools that were implemented after Katrina. So what happened was so Katrina happens, all these schools get destroyed. They have this need to open up a bunch of schools in a short period of time. And so prior to Katrina, there'd been a real central authority where all the schools, except for a certain class of failing schools, all the schools were sort of in this hierarchy that was managed top down. And they realized that just sort of because of this contingency, a bunch of schools that had to be opened at once, that, well, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to allow any community that wants to have their school become a charter school, get a charter. And so you had this extreme, bunch of applications for charters. In fact, they end up with having, I believe at the time it was true, I don't know if it's still true, but the most charter schools per capita.
80%?
Yeah, at the time. And so so then with this sort of explosion of charter schools in the wake of it. And so to the extent that charter schools are an improvement over this top-down hierarchical system that they had that it turned out was failing, then yeah, that one of the benefits of something like a Katrina is that it opened that up. The student I was talking about, though, found that it was perhaps something to celebrate, but we shouldn't be too quick, because they ended up with a lot of constraints on the charter schools that in fact existed, right? And so they, the charter schools that it turns out in the U.S. that are the most successful end up with full control over their budgets and selection and all these kinds of things, that they end up putting restrictions on their budgets and what they could spend it on. They force them to rent certain spaces and not other spaces. They force them to use certain busing systems or what have you, as opposed to having a choice of it. They force them to serve certain meals in the cafeteria. So all the kinds of things that you expect from like charter schools that sort of generate their success or have been shown to generate their success, many of those things they ended up sort of clamping down on and not allowing them to do. And so some of the charter schools, like you have these circumstances of charter schools, in fact, sharing buildings with regular schools. And so to the extent that the charter schools wanting to create this entirely different culture and what have you, it can't do it because, in fact, in the very same building, it is a regular school that has the old sort of culture and context. And so you did get its breaking down of special interests, as you talked about, and I guess as Olson would have predicted, but it wasn't complete, I guess is the other way to put it. Any other questions, comments? Thank you.
Food back here, so help yourself.
Thank you very much.